when I worked on amending our parking requirements for office, retail, medical, dental, and lending institutions. There were a couple members of City Council at the time that wanted to see us reducing unnecessary imperviousness, and they passed a resolution to council that basically gave us direction to go explore city code to see where we could reduce unnecessary imperviousness. And of course, off-street parking regulations were glaring because at the time we had pretty large minimums. For instance, a minimum of 5 spaces per 1,000 for retail, a minimum of 4 for office, and we had no maximums. So we spent some time looking at what other communities were doing, looking at best practices, and we decided that we also did a lot of parking counts during the go-go years of the late 90s. And so the long and the short of it is we were able to reduce our parking requirements for office basically from 4 spaces per 1,000 as a minimum to 3, and we imposed a maximum for the first time of 4. So now a developer would have a range to choose from, 3 to 4 spaces. We do the same thing with retail. For most retailers, we took that 5 spaces per 1,000 minimum down to 3.25 and added a maximum of 3.75. What this did was it gave property owners the opportunity to construct infill development in their retail center, at their office site. And so we have seen some centers around town come in with these with new infill projects. So that's also a win from our perspective. Today, we're now sort of 20 years in, or a couple decades beyond these original amendments, which amended parking standards from 1958, by the way. And we're looking at the possibility of a sort of a multi-phase approach to this. The initial phase might be this concept of maybe removing the minimums. It would also include this notion of possibility of adding maximums to more uses, more use categories, and the possibility of maybe tweaking our recently amended parking ordinance that included electric vehicles as a requirement. So that's the background and a little history of where we are today. I'm going to pause here to see if Brett wanted to add anything from his perspective.
No, thanks to all of you for participating. Just to reiterate, what we wanted to do is we're just starting this conversation and wanted to hear from you on your perspectives, your experiences, what your thoughts are on some of this. Generally, I would just say that I think I'm projecting here that removal of minimum parking standards is probably of moderate interest to most of you, in that I'm guessing that in sort of undertaking your project designs and the like, you're probably rarely looking at our minimums as the standard, but rather more from a market viability perspective. But I would anticipate that we haven't heard a lot of concern about our existing parking maximums, but I know it is a frequent conversation, so I anticipate that just being harder. And then as we get into the discussion, I think I might also like to just talk about some of our past land use plans and talking about specifically the push-pull of private versus publicly provided parking in the downtown districts. Some of our plans really guide us towards looking at using the public parking system as a mechanism to be able to provide all that parking and variable cost structures and variable pricing structures, which it becomes less effective when it's a blend of both public and privately provided parking. So the short of it is we'd just really love to hear your feedback about these ideas, your questions, your concerns, your thoughts. so that as we move forward with considering some of these ideas, we have a better understanding from your perspectives.
Hey, Brett, let's start with some introductions first, since members of the public will be able to review this. And then I see Darren's hand up. So I'm going to go ahead and start that. My name is Jeff Kahn. I'm one of the planners in our Planning and Development Services group, and I've been asked to assist Brett with this effort.
Yeah, and I'm Brett Leonard. I'm the planning manager. Sean, maybe you could introduce yourself and then pick somebody else to go after you.
Yeah, I'm Sean Avera with Hughes Properties. We have owned several properties in Ann Arbor and have developed several properties in Ann Arbor. I'm going to go Andrew, since he appears to be next.
Hey, Andrew Hauptman with Yellowstone, Oxford. We're on the mostly predominant on the south side of town. A lot of office, R&D, medical office. Sorry, let's go with next. Let's go with Charles. Is he gone yet?
Nope. Hi, everybody. This is Charles Griffith. I'm with the Ecology Center, nonprofit here in the city, and interested in parking issues and reducing unnecessary parking. Let's just say that. Okay, how about Darren?
Hi, I'm Darren McKinnon with First Martin. We're a commercial manager, property developer, and owner. We have a number of office spaces in the downtown and on the north side of town. We also have some multifamily on the north side and the south side, as well as downtown. We also have hospitality and parking facilities in the downtown. Also, I serve on the DDA and was former, I guess it's the chairperson of the operations committee. The operations committee is tasked with managing the public parking system. So very familiar with what Brett is talking about in terms of the way the code reads, in terms of asking the DDA to write contracts. And Sean and I have worked together on some of his projects on Southview to use that cleverly to get around some of the existing ordinance obstacles. And I guess Greg, last but not least.
Yeah, this is Greg Kopp. I'm with MABD. We own office space both downtown, Carytown, and in the south side of town.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you, everyone. Just a reminder for those folks who are watching this at home, this is the beginning of what might be a series of conversations we're having with individuals who have been identified as stakeholders, folks who are sort of heavily involved in this world of off-street parking. We also invited a representative from the Huron River Watershed Council and representatives from the design community who may be able to join us a little later or at future conversations.
Yeah, and so I would also say, just to sort of maybe kick us off, recently the city has adopted, I referenced the city's land use plan about downtown parking, but the city has also recently adopted a comprehensive transportation plan that specifically advocates for the removal of parking minimums by next year, in fact. We have referenced the previous land use plan as it relates to downtown plan. And then recently the city council has adopted a strategy around climate carbon neutrality via its A20 plan that also, in addition to sort of parking related, relative to parking, advocates for a drastic reduction in the vehicular miles traveled for within the city over the next by 2030. And so when we're talking about parking policy, I think a couple of things frame it, of course. One, parking costs a lot of money to build. It costs money to maintain. It can have the one thing that you get with a parking space is a vehicle mile travel because it is sort of providing the infrastructure to induce that pattern of transportation. But obviously, that comes from a history of a community that was built on that as a transportation model, and fortunately, in addition to a robust public transportation system. So it's not obviously not always as easy as the city council or I identifying the sustainability goals and snapping our fingers and instantaneously changing the habits and patterns of transportation choice here in the city of Ann Arbor. And so the discussion about this is, what are the ways in which we can influence through, in this case, land use policy, the ways in which our regulations are sort of helping or hurting the cause. So to that end, maybe we could start with what I think is probably sort of the easier of the concepts, and just sort of start it with, and again, just would appreciate sort of an open conversation with all of you. One simple change that we are envisioning is potentially the removal of all parking minimums. That is to say that what sense does it make for the city, given these multiple goals, to be dictating a minimum level of parking that might be, in some cases, higher than the level that you or other developers or designers envision for the successful operation of their project? What are your thoughts on that? And then before we get into it, I think it also would provide a lot of utility and flexibility for adaptive reuse of buildings, as often parking can be an important component of measuring a conversion of use from one type to another. So I've seen both Darren and Sean. Thoughts? Sean, maybe you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think getting rid of minimums, and I'm sure probably everybody else will agree, makes the most sense. I mean, when you look at some of the projects we've done in downtown, like we look at our Vic Village North student housing project, which we couldn't get parking on for a variety of different reasons, yet we were mandated to do it. It has not affected our renting at all. Now, I think that applies. I think, markets can drive that. So certain uses may need certain parking requirements, whereas some don't. So I think it's a great first step towards that, is getting rid of those minimums.
So would you be willing to expand on that a little bit more? So in that case, I think that was one of the creative sort of arrangements that Darren was referencing. Am I correct to say that those parking spaces are pretty non-critical to the success of that project at all?
Yeah, so we have 5 full-time ones, and then we have, I think, 45 of the evening passes. I think we needed like 50 or some combination of that. The 5 that we have for the building are utilized. They're utilized by staff, and then obviously they're there. But in regards to the evening passes, I don't think, maybe we've had one person take it up because of the limitations on it. But most of the students, they're either getting parking somewhere else in the downtown if they need it, because there's a couple other places that have the ability to do that and rent out, or they just don't need it because they're utilizing Uber, Lyft, other means of transportation. So in a student housing aspect, that I think makes sense, where it doesn't impact us. Now, if this was a market rate apartment, that probably would be a different question of the necessity for that, because people are coming and going. They're utilizing vehicle transportation a lot differently than students are, as well as obviously with office and retail, and those types of uses have different demands on them than certain sectors do. So for us, it hasn't been a very critical piece. I know when we did Vic South, we had to put a parking in at a extreme premium because it was required, whereas we may not have needed to do all of the parking required because of just the market not dictating it.
Darren, did you want to
Yeah.
share?
So, worked with Sean on what he referenced with Vic Village South, and it made a lot of sense, and primarily because it was a student housing, and we realized at the DDA at the time that, student housing is a different kind of housing, and it's the one we've had a lot of recently, and to require all of this parking to be built, usually in a structured manner, even underground structure, is incredibly cost prohibitive. So I would say that expanding that beyond student housing, and if we're just looking at downtown, we can have a conversation about outside of downtown, but no developer, regardless of the type of project they're building, is going to build more parking than they feel they need. So having a parking minimum doesn't make any sense today. Now, to go to parking maximums, that's a third rail you don't want to touch, because if you start putting parking maximums in, you're getting involved in the planning and financing of that building. So I would advocate, in short, parking minimums, throw them out, but don't touch parking maximums, because no one is going to build more parking than they feel they need. I understand there's this, climate change related thing where we feel that parking is evil, or parking is, if you don't have parking, then we won't have cars, which I think is not true. Cars are already here, but parking minimums bad, parking minimums bad, parking maximums not needed, also bad.
So Darren, so you would think that the city doesn't have a regulatory role in that sort of balance of inducing demand and vehicular use, because the market will get there?
Absolutely. Like I said, building parking structures is expensive. No private developer wants to do it. Frankly, the DDA doesn't want to do it either. They're very expensive to operate, and the DDA doesn't really want to enter any of these contracts that came before the DDA in my tenure. The DDA feels an obligation to work with those developers because of the way the code was written, it gave that option, and the DDA didn't want to be in the position of saying, we're going to prevent this from happening, because it's true to say that the developer can't afford to build, however many spots in a structure that add millions of dollars to a development. And if the DDA can be the one that just signs a piece of paper and allows them to use existing infrastructure, then they are going to do it. But I would say that minimums and maximums, just keep the city out of it and let the developer figure out what they're going to build. And I would not be afraid at all of somebody coming along saying, oh, I'm going to just build extra parking just because it's just, things are expensive enough. No one's building extra structured parking. That's just not.
How does the city, so in that case, isn't there an argument to be made though that if, all things being considered, if parking's built as part of that downtown development and it's not, if this one of the city's goals is affordability, do you think that that's going to have that impact on affordability? That's going to be less costs that need to be recouped through the operation of the development?
Well, there's a number of things you've touched on there. I mean, affordable housing doesn't necessarily mean people don't have cars. What you're seeing these days is two types of housing: market rate student and market rate luxury. The parking needs for those two is extremely different. They're at opposite ends of the spectrum. No one's buying $1 million condo downtown that they can't park their car. That's just not realistic. How deep is the desire for more and more luxury condos in downtown? Nobody really knows. It seems to be so far so good, but we've seen a lot go up recently. When you talk about affordable housing, you're talking about subsidized housing. That's a different animal. Doesn't mean those people don't have cars.
I wasn't really talking specifically about subsidized. I was just thinking, I think one of the reasons that affordability is such a topic in the city is because the market for housing is high. And I wasn't thinking about, not providing parking in the context of sort of subsidized housing. In fact, the ordinance kind of already addresses that, but rather in, what is the nexus between the city either requiring or allowing 2 parking spaces with one of those luxury condos with how that impacts the price of that condo?
Well, I understand. I know where you're going. I mean, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but the reality is that if you're going to tell somebody like Tom Fitzsimmons that he has to build a luxury condo development with no parking, he's not going to build it, because he can't sell $1 million condo without a parking space. That's just a reality. So what you're asking is, if we put an ordinance out there that said thou can't build any parking spaces downtown, it's illegal to build parking spaces, then would that somehow force the stop of luxury condos? Possibly, or they're just going to go ask for a variance like we have with what we've seen with the EV ordinance, where it doesn't really make sense, and so everybody lines up and gets a variance against it. So I just would stay away from maximums. I think it's a really slippery slope, and it's something the city doesn't need to get into. And this whole, what I call a reverse field of dreams, even though I'm told not to use that analogy, it's if you build it where they will come. That was what the idea. We went with the EV charging stations. These cars don't exist, but if we build all this infrastructure, then all of a sudden these cars will show up and they'll be there. This whole idea, if you don't build parking spaces, that the cars won't exist, that doesn't make any sense. The cars are already here. The people that drive them are here. You know, the transition in society away from cars is not going to happen in the next 5 minutes. It's going to be a generational shift.
Well, the interesting thing real quick too, Brett, as you look at things to me that just don't make sense sometimes within the plans. So when you look at the A20 plan and there's reduce the vehicle miles, well, if that is to reduce carbon emissions, but when you have the majority now and almost every car manufacturer moving more and more to all electric platforms, I don't understand now why the car is such an evil device when you're trying to push people to go to EVs because they're green and cleaner and all this other stuff. So you have these competing things there. And like Darren said, I don't think it's the government's role to try to pick winners and losers, which is what you're doing when you're trying to determine maximums, because you're trying to basically force the market to do your will, which never seems to work. You know, when you have wage and price control, when you try to control wages and you try to control price of things, it doesn't work. It's the same thing here. So if I have a development that I'm like, hey, I'm doing a market rate apartment and I need 2 parking spaces because that's what the market is dictating, but the city is saying I can only do a half a space per unit or per bedroom or whatever, the project's not going to get built. I think you saw the same thing of what's happened in downtown with the affordable housing premium changes. Nothing has been built under that because you can't build anything underneath that because the market won't support it. And I think those are the unintended consequences when these ordinances get changed and whatnot. Is I don't think it's looked at as to how the market is going to be handled, you know, from that perspective. It can work in theory maybe, but in reality it doesn't. So
thank you both. I'm not I appreciate you. I'm just my questions are not trying to challenge your perspective, just trying to understand and just tease out as much information as I can as we're moving forward and ultimately advising the Planning Commission. So, anybody else have thoughts on minimums?
Brett, I have a question actually.
Yeah.
Darren had talked about you know, not imposing maximums. I guess my question is, for those folks who are dealing with for office and retail and others, how are those working? We've been imposing those maximums for a couple of decades now. Are they working okay? Are they a source of frustration? What are your thoughts on that? And these are for areas outside of downtown, by the way.
Is that aimed at me, or is it just?
Andrew, go for it. I see your hand up.
Well, I mean, Jeff, you know, we've had, by the way, just stepping back, I apologize, I've had a pretty bad connection here, so I just wanted to reintroduce myself. Andrew Huffman with Yellowstone and Oxford. I'm an architect. We're running the construction side for Oxford companies. We actually do have a lot of residential downtown and some properties downtown as well, but my focus anyways, has been on the peripheries. On the south side of town, to answer, responding to Jeff, you know, we lost a pretty big deal that went to SIO based on parking maximums as they currently are. We're not seeing, even with COVID, we're seeing a reduction in office market, but we're not seeing a reduction in density. people are still going to cram in folks into office spaces. When they're being used for lab, R&D, and other backfill, which ends up being a very collaborative environment with high density. So, I mean, the economics of those spaces doesn't change. The density is still going to be there. I think if the focus is, so I share Darren and Sean's, I want to just parrot everything that they said, and I would say it applies to peripheries on both ends as well. If the focus here has been impervious surface, electrification, I mean, you know, getting people on buses, you know, starting with the first one, I would focus on impervious surface then, and with electric vehicles, you know, why not have, and I'm not in favor, or I'm just putting this out there as ideas that I haven't heard. What about mandated electric spots in lieu of, I mean, if we're trying to control that, I mean, and if you would control impervious surface and electrical vehicle parking, that seems to be the goal here. So I should say focus on that, not on sort of driving the, trying to push back on where the market's going. And I mean, you know, you talked about driving people towards mass transit. I totally agree, but is that on the same page? You know, those are all things that are kind of long-term discussions that I think, you know, should be considered outside of just capping vehicle parking.
Hey, Andrew, can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question, Andrew? Because you obviously, you guys do a lot more office and everything. And I think this whole reduction of vehicle travel and everything is predicated, and Brett, you and Jeff, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, is predicated upon, I think, two things: having people live and work in Ann Arbor so they don't have to travel. They're using mass transit to do that. And then there's the general use of mass transit. And I guess I just don't know how feasible that is to try to push to that, to say, you know, this is the way we're going to reduce vehicle travel, because really that's the only way you're going to do it. Either people live and work in this town and they don't have to travel with a vehicle, or they're using mass transit, which I just don't see a lot of people do. I think you see a lot of people that work in Ann Arbor, live in Scioto, Pittsfield, Brighton, those areas which require vehicle travel. I don't know, Andrew, if you guys have had any, you know, you guys have an idea of anything, but could you maybe tackle that, I guess, or address that?
I'd love to tackle it, but I'll just address it. So I guess you know, your point of trying to reduce automotive travel, kind of just, again, picking up on what Darren and Sean had said, cars are here. I don't see you being able to do that. I think what you're going to be doing is basically driving away, or, you know, trying to control the market by driving away folks that want to live outside. You're not going to drive more people in Ann Arbor and then create more affordable housing. I mean, that seems counterintuitive. You know, you're trying to make people live in Ann Arbor, and simultaneously you want to keep the demand and market lower for housing so that we can keep more affordable housing. Seems counterintuitive. I think we have to accept cars are going to be coming into Ann Arbor. This is a destination. People love it here, but not everybody can live here. I grew up in Ann Arbor. I love Ann Arbor. This is my city. I love it, but I don't live here. I live in Brighton. I love where I live because I wanted some land and live up. You know, we have some property with water. I couldn't do that in Ann Arbor, and that's okay. So I shuttle in, but going electric makes the most sense. I don't see how I can get rid of a car and still have a lifestyle. So if you're saying that you can't have my lifestyle, that's or that's a problem, I would argue against that.
Greg, and then Charles.
Yeah, I was just going to say a similar thing too. I mean, really, the trend, you know, if you believe what you read, and I know it with my kids, is the days of somebody working somewhere for 30 years are over, right? So they switch jobs a lot, and so it remains to be seen what the outcome of COVID is, and in terms of remote work. But the reality is, the younger generation now is going to switch jobs regularly. And so does that mean they're going to switch residences every time they switch a job? I mean, it's not realistic, right? So you're going to continually not only for lifestyle choices, like Andrew says, but also for just practicality. People aren't going to continue to move and maybe live in the same city in which they work, and so vehicles aren't going away. Like Andrew said, my kids all grew up in Ann Arbor schools. I lived here for 20 years. My wife wanted to live on a lake. We moved out to a lake several years ago. So, there's going to be people that they want some land, they want to be on a lake, they want to live near other people, their family. There are going to be reasons they don't want to live in Ann Arbor, but maybe their job is here, and cars are going to be here. And the other thing I guess I wanted to say about the maximums is, the challenge in office space too is we can sometimes, if we're lucky, predict what the first generation space is going to look like, the density, how many parking spaces we're going to need, but we can't predict the second generation space, right? So there's always a bit when we're working in other markets, trying to figure out what the optimal space is, because I think as, I don't remember if it was Sean or Darren said, we don't want to build more space than we have to, but we want to make sure we have space for the life of the building, right? So to say there's a maximum, I'm not in favor of that. The minimum will take care of itself. If we end up having a bunch of empty office parking spaces out here on the south side of Ann Arbor, and there's no minimum, we'll build more buildings on them. I mean, that will take care of itself.
Charles?
Yeah, Charles Griffith here again. I think I agree with most of what I'm hearing. I don't really see that you move people into transit or other alternatives by restricting car parking at the place where you live. I think you certainly don't want to build more than you have to, and I hear a lot of voices echoing that. For other parking for folks that don't live in town, you certainly don't want to build too much of that either, if it is inducing more car travel than you need. Not to I think but the best way to approach that is by providing more alternatives to people, not by saying you can't park here. So and to the point I heard earlier about the seeming conflict between moving people to electric and reducing VMT, I get that, but one of the rationales for that, of trying to do both simultaneously, is that it's going to take a while to transition to electric vehicles, and in the meanwhile, it still makes sense to provide alternatives to folks so that they don't have to get into a personal vehicle. And partly that's an equity issue for those who can't afford or can't drive for whatever reason. But also as somebody who lives in Ann Arbor, who works, at least used to work downtown, I rarely drove my car. I either took a bus or rode a bicycle, or on a really nice day when I have extra time, I would walk. So I don't need to drive my car, but it's nice to have alternatives here, and the more convenient those are and more desirable they are, I think more people will take advantage of them. And so I think that's the goal behind 820, to try to continue to reduce unnecessary automobile traffic and in the city center.
Yeah, a couple questions. I heard. I think the comment. I think you made it, Greg, about sort of with office parking, and I think this was mentioned by others as well. It's hard enough to get the first use of that building right, let alone the subsequent uses of that building. I wonder. I heard somebody mention. I think it was you, Andrew, about a potential sort of user that ended up going to SIO. I guess I wonder if anybody could share some anecdotes of help us understand how our parking regulations have made either a project not happen as referenced, or how a project or development might be difficult to manage right now because of those regulations?
So Brett, this is Sean. So, I mean, this kind of is somewhat there, but it has to do around the vehicle, which all of this has to do, and which you know about. So we had the North Star Bank project over on Stadium that is looking outside of Ann Arbor because, contrary to what, the Planning Commission believes, drive-throughs still have a purpose and a behind a lot of development. So I think you're going to see certain things, especially around drive-throughs or around certain types of retail, that when you start to get into these things are going to say, I don't want to get into Ann Arbor. I know I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm going to go to the outskirts. So you're going to lose that business, out there. And so I think that's just one example where you have seen a 60-person business now say, okay, fine, we're going to take our business elsewhere. You guys have made it too difficult to develop. You're not recognizing the reality because we're the experts when it comes to the business, and we're being told by other people that, well, no, that doesn't hold true. That attitude that's there is very challenging to deal with. So I think you're going to see more of that when, again, you have the governmental bodies trying to pick, in essence, winners and losers of things. And I mean, if that's what they're wanting to do, then fine, that'll happen. But I think you're going to start to see businesses move outside of town. I mean, we've even been told through some things that certain lenders are starting to blacklist Ann Arbor because of just some of these things of saying they're making business way too challenging to do in Ann Arbor. We'll go elsewhere because we know that our clients and that'll be able to do things that make sense. So I think the challenge that is that we've set this goal of 2030, which I think is an unrealistic goal, and everything is being looked at from that prism. I think, I don't know if it was Charles or Greg that was talking about obviously providing options, and I completely agree. I just think you've put yourself behind the 8 ball already on something that's not really achievable. And so you're trying to push things, whether they make common sense or not, in order to try to accomplish and check off something on a box and hit this goal. And I just don't think you can do that. I don't think it's being looked at in a reasonable manner of rather than coming out to us and saying, how do we work together to get to this? Rather it's, this is what we say, and this is how you're going to do it to do what we want you to do. It's not a collaborative, back and forth to try to, how do we get to an objective? So for what it is. So.
Well, that's part of the reason why we're here today, trying to be more collaborative. Greg?
Yeah, I was just going to try to answer your direct question, Brett. I mean, I can't, unfortunately, in the last 2 years especially, not a whole lot of activity in the office market, right? So I can't give you a specific example then, but we definitely had one prior to that that was interested. We're parked at a little bit above 3 per thousand here out at State Street Commons, and that wasn't enough for somebody, right? And again, you got to think about the mentality of if you've got a sizable employer that maybe is opening a regional office or moving here, they want to draw from the largest geographic area possible, right? And so part of what attracts them to Ann Arbor, obviously, is the workforce that we have. But when I say the workforce we have, it's not walking distance to the office building. It's within a driving distance around, right? And so they want to make sure that they've got enough parking to maximize their opportunities to hire the people that they don't yet have employed, right? So they're taking a bit of a dart in terms of the number they need, but they're hoping to pull them from Brighton and Livonia and maybe Jackson and, Saline at all points of the compass. And so when they say they need 4 per thousand instead of 3 per thousand, they're going to move out to the townships where they can get that kind of parking, if that's what they feel is critical to get the employment base that they need.
So has that been common? Is that building sort of struggling because of, you've heard that repeatedly, or was that sort of more of a isolated concern?
Again, unfortunately, there's nothing common right now because there's just no activity, right? And we don't know it's a great question, which I think everybody on this call would like to know. What's that going to mean to office in a year, in 2 years? I have no idea, right? But it has happened. And anytime it limits the marketability of your building, it changes the economics, right? So it's yet another hurdle that you have in a building inside of Ann Arbor as opposed to a building in one of the townships. I mean, there's obviously pluses too, right? But it's one of the negatives to operating in the city and maybe being underparked versus being out in the townships.
Thank you. Maybe another question. I think this, I don't have data to understand how widely this is happening or if it's happening in different areas of the city. But my perception, particularly in the rental residential market, is there are more instances now where property owners are actually leasing spaces separate from the apartments, from maybe a more traditional model of every apartment gets a parking space or every apartment gets a couple parking spaces or what have you. I'm curious if anybody has seen that, heard of that, or applied that model to any of their developments in the city.
This is Darren. I'll answer that. I would say it's the first differentiator is it downtown or not downtown? Because if you're not downtown, you're not renting an apartment if you don't have a car. You're probably not even living not downtown. But certainly covered parking versus not covered parking in the multifamily world, there's different price points for that. So yeah, there's extra cost, but it's not like the people renting those parking spaces aren't already living there. There's just an additional cost for covered parking. In the downtown, I could imagine that in some of these older kind of homes that have been converted into multifamily, predominantly on campus student housing, certainly you've got some of those apartments that are leased by students who don't own or need a car, and you have the spaces available, and so the landlords are opportunistic and they say, hey, office worker or whoever that works in the area, we've got the spot, if you'd like to pay us a couple $100, we'd be happy to let you park here. So I'm sure that happens in the downtown where you have non-residents parking during the Monday to Friday 9 to 5.
Do you would you speculate that that seems to be a tool that's good for giving flexibility to managing the demand of that, but then on the other hand, I have to question, like, well, did you end up with that capacity because the city was imposing a higher minimum than what was needed?
Well, I would say that the houses where that's happened, the locations where that's happening, again, this is not, I'm not speaking from data, but just being in town for 25 years and knowing how things work, I'd say that those parking spaces, if you're getting at people that park somewhere that's a residential area that they don't live in, that those locations are predominantly student neighborhoods on a house that's maybe 100 years old, that was built as a single family home, that's now cut up into apartments for students. I don't know that you can make a whole lot of extrapolations on the parking market and the development world based on that scenario.
Any other thoughts about, so hearing obviously a lot of concern about maximums, maybe even some concern about our existing maximums. But basically, I think wide agreement on elimination of minimums. Any other thoughts or questions or comments on those? And I'd like to maybe we could jump into EV parking a little bit.
Brett, I just have a general question for the group, and that is, I guess firstly, we have downtown parking and that whole world, and then we have everything else, which is most of Ann Arbor. And these are two different parking standards. But so with regard to downtown, if we get rid of minimums, likely we're going to have developers proposing projects which has very little parking. And I guess my question is, what are the consequences for that? Are these developers going to turn to the DDA and say, okay, we need 60 spaces from you to make this project work, or 40 spaces or whatever? Or will it fuel a demand for individuals who have private parking lots in and around downtown and disincentivize those property owners from redeveloping their property, which might be mostly a surface parking lot? Will we be creating an unintended consequence of fueling demand for surface parking lots in and around downtown? And are we going to be giving this problem over to the DDA? Basically taking a private challenge and giving it to the public sector to deal with.
I was going to say Darren and the operations committee have to figure it out.
Yeah, it's all on Darren. I think, Jeff, this is Sean. I think you have to unpack a few things there. I think it's going to go by the type of use. So if you're talking student housing, like we said earlier, I don't think you need a whole lot of parking per se with student housing. When you get into market rate apartments, however, you're going to maybe in the downtown area, if you're trying to look at multi-story multifamily, I think developers will look at what they need. I don't know necessarily if it's going to go back on the DDA, because the DDA, and Darren can talk to this, I think it's put pretty much a moratorium, or at least on certain structures, of any additional, parking. Now that may have changed because of COVID and everything else, because I know we were able to get some parking passes that originally was like a wait list of like 5 years. But I think the other thing though, Jeff, is I don't think you're going to see in the downtown area any more large multifamily or multi-story developments until the affordable housing premiums get completely redone, because you cannot do a building over 400% FAR in downtown with the current premiums the way they are. It just will not financially work at all. We did an analysis like on our Vic South building, and to build the exact same building that we did under the new ordinance, we'd have to raise the rents on everything else 20%. The market can't support that. And so you have that issue there. So, I mean, I understand your parking thing, but I almost see it as a moot point when you're not going to really have any development, because development's not going to be able to happen because of that. So.
This is Darren. So what I would say, the concern on the DDA structures, publicly owned structures, is real. We do have a policy that I spearheaded a few years ago that has a maximum contract length of 15 years, and that's because 100% because the current zoning required at least 15-year contract. And so if you eliminate, as part of this rejiggering, if you eliminate the ability of developers to satisfy their parking needs, parking requirements, which is the minimums, by executing a contract with the DDA, then that issue goes away. The DDA doesn't need to execute a contract because there's no minimum, doesn't serve a purpose anymore. Does that mean that there's going to be more demand on the public parking garages on a transient use basis as opposed to on a contractual basis? Probably, but there's also a lot of revenue that comes into the DDA, and 20% of which goes right to the main city general fund as well. So from a real financial issue for the city, your CFO will tell you that they love the parking system, which has been drastically hurt by COVID, but it's bouncing back now. So when you talk about getting to the point like we were before COVID, where you couldn't get a parking pass, monthly pass, that problem has kind of solved itself, but it'll come back again once we get up to capacity in the office market. In terms of Jeff's question about disincentivizing private property owners with vacant lots, speaking from First Martin standpoint, who owns the largest downtown surface lot, this parking minimum is one of the reasons why we're not developing. I mean, the cost to build the amount of parking spaces we'd need to build on that lot is one of the reasons it hasn't happened. I mean, the amount of structured parking we'd have to build would be tremendous. So I would disagree completely with the fact that, or with the notion that eliminating parking minimums is somehow going to help surface lots. Surface lots exist not because of the highest and best use, because it's so dang expensive to develop. If it was easier and less expensive to develop, all the surface lots would have already been developed, and parking minimums are part of that cost. It's not all of it. Certainly there's, as Brett knows, many, many things that are very expensive, and Sean just touched on some of them, but no owner of a surface lot wants it to be a surface lot. So I don't know if Jeff had a third question, but those are the two I remember.
All right, let's maybe shift gears to EV parking. So some of our conversation we just had, and this conversation just bore out through a long discussion and adoption of our EV parking ordinance. I think it is, I think the conversation here is reflective of some of the reasons for that ordinance. That is that EV vehicles are moving in a place that by the industry, all the makers are moving in that direction. They have a higher purchase rate now than they did a year ago, and we expect that to increase. And so part of the intention of that ordinance was, if we think that's valuable, what steps can the city do from a regulatory perspective to make it easier for people? That is to adopt regulations and ultimately the infrastructure so that it's easier to live and or work or both in this community. If you have an EV parking infrastructure at the place you live, the place you work, the places you recreate, the places you seek services. And so that is sort of the background of the intention. The realization of it in the crafting of the language, and I think there was a reference to some of the variances that have been recently considered to different outcomes, of course, is that the city adopted language, and I'll take as much responsibility for this as anybody should. It was triggered by a site plan for city council approval. And the intention was that this should be a requirement when a site is being redeveloped, and that the ordinance, the best time to put in this infrastructure is when the site is being developed, because it is very expensive to retrofit it, particularly into surface parking lots. Because of other aspects of the city's unified development code that require a whole category of site plans to go to city council approval, I don't think that it's always a clean application of that ordinance. And so part of the thing that we're looking at is finding the right trigger for when those standards would apply. One of the ways to look at that is to try and measure it not in who is taking action on a site plan, but rather when basically parking lots are being expanded or constructed. That is the time that the EV parking infrastructure should be realized, recognizing that there are times that a site plan has been considered that frankly involve no change to a parking lot, an existing parking lot. That is I don't think one is right or one is wrong. I do think that it is clearly more logical to make sure that the infrastructure is being put in place when the ground is open, when the grade is being done, when the base is being put in. And it is more difficult to accomplish those things when you're building an addition and you weren't planning on touching the parking lot, nor did you have to touch the parking lot but for that standard. So that could result in a slightly slower realization in some places, but I think in a way a more appropriate way to install that infrastructure in our community. What are your thoughts? How has that impacted your projects? I know, Darren, you've definitely had one recently. that is one of the things that we're contemplating, is sort of trying to right size when those standards should kick in and when they shouldn't. Greg.
So I guess I'll start since I own an EV. I installed a level 2 charger at home, and the only two times I charge when I'm away from home is when it's free and when I'm traveling more than 300 miles. So having a EV charger at the restaurant, the retail place, the church, even my gym has an EV charger. I'll use it because it's free, but I'm not there long enough to make it really worthwhile. And quite honestly, on a macro scale, the economic investment of them putting that charger in makes no sense to me. So while I appreciate it and I use it because it's free to get my 30 cents of electricity every time I'm at the gym, I just don't think it's good public policy to be putting those in those kind of places. They should be at residences and prepped at residences. I support that. And at businesses, if we decide to do it as a benefit for the tenants, that might make sense. But again, quite honestly, I can use that vehicle to its fullest capacity without ever charging, anywhere here at work or at a restaurant or any of those places. So I think at some point there's too many of them, too many chargers.
Sean?
I think to go, what Greg said too. I mean, the couple of the other things, like when we were working on the stadium one, like there's part of it that says your handicap spaces have to be have EV stations on them, which again, if it's a retail, most of those are always going to be at the front of the business. A lot of times it's more so retail. It made no sense. Like I'm putting a charger in a location that is probably you don't really have handicap vehicles currently that are EV yet. And even still, I think, the Greg's point, I have an EV vehicle that's at my house and I have a level 2 charger. And it's the same thing he said. I'm only doing it in those instances. Or if I'm going to be, if I'm going someplace and it's a long period of time and I just happen to forget to charge or whatever, and I need, even if I have to pay for it a little bit, I'm going to be there for a couple hours, because a level 2 charger, you're not going to get anything out of it if you plug in for 15 minutes when you're running into a quick service type of a location like a bank or something along those lines. It doesn't make any sense. I could see it somewhat in office a little bit, because again, office users are there for a day and they may use them in those instances. I think the other problem though is, which made no sense to me at all, is the various levels that you have. So you have your EVIs, your EVCs, and your EVRs. The EVRs make absolutely no sense to me. If I'm putting in the conduit and I have the capacity in the panel, that should be sufficient. Whether I run the wire now or not makes absolutely no impact. It just adds more cost, because it's like, well, I don't know when I'm going to add those. If I add those 5-10 years from now, we may come to find, hey, there's a water leak. It got in the conduit, it corroded the wire. Now I got to rip it all out and I got to redo it. So that made no sense to me, because the wire, especially now, is a really high cost. But conduit, that's cheap to put in. That's easy. I may just say, hey, I'm going to put it to all my parking spaces because it's just so easy. But then the other big problem you have here right now is you have, in Ann Arbor, you have an electrical capacity issue with DTE. So now you start beyond the whole electrification, which is a whole separate conversation. You start trying to add in EV stations on an already delicate, electrical, infrastructure. You got issues. So it's like we're trying to push all this stuff, yet we haven't fully, I don't think, addressed the whole infrastructure issue with DTE either. So you got these multiple facets of things.
But can I push back a little bit? So you just gave a great example of when there are chargers there, if you forget to charge your car. So having that infrastructure at the location adds a viability to you having an EV parking or an EV vehicle that would be absent without those. And then Additionally, I totally appreciate, the balance of you going into the bank for 15 minutes, but part of this is also recognizing that there's a lot of employees at that bank who are there for long term, and their access to those same chargers provides benefit and utility to them to maybe make the choice to purchase an EV vehicle where they didn't before.
I think it's two different things though, Brett. If you're talking, again, one thing to clarify is I said, if you're looking at an office type use, or in this instance, a retail, like, a part of the bank. And again, I think it depends on the type of use, but if you're, in that instance, while, the bank side of it, the operational side of it, yes, people are going to be there all day. That's one thing that I don't see too much of an issue, but these quick things where people are just coming in, they're running in and running out. They're not going to stop, plug in their car for the 5-10 minutes they're going to be in a building and then unplug and leave. They're not going to get anything from that. It's not going to do, it may add 1/10 of a mile to the thing. And we're obviously not mandating DC fast charges. So again, I think you have to look at the type of use. And I think, even I think like restaurants and those types of things, again, my wife and I went out to dinner the other night. We were at the restaurant for 45 minutes. I'm not going to probably plug my car in for 45 minutes because I maybe get 2-3 miles. And it's just, it's not something I'm going to do when I'm 10 minutes from home and I'm going to plug it in overnight and charge it anyways. Again, I think you have to look at the uses of what you're doing. Those uses where you're going to have a 8-hour day makes sense. But if you're looking at things that are very short turnaround ones, it doesn't make any sense. You've just added, extra cost onto, a property owner and a developer and a business owner that bears no benefit to them. It's just an extra cost because it's not really going to get utilized very much.
Andrew?
Hey, I just wanted to second what Sean just said, but I also wanted to say that even for office space, something that we're dealing with, we've got plenty, anecdotally speaking, of people driving Teslas to work, and I don't see them parking in front of the EV chargers that we've got around here. There are people that will use them. I think it's probably more opportunistic. I don't believe that if you build, they will come kind of concept that you were referring to. I think that people still need to drive to the store. They still need to drive to see grandma. They're not going to base their purchase on whether they can park at work and charge. There's too many other factors. So I just disagree with that thinking. And the technology, it's early. I mean, this is a technology that's still emerging. Why would we want to invest so heavily in an infrastructure that is still changing? I don't think it's a necessary component to driving people towards EV.
Thank you. Darren?
Yep, thanks. Again, I was, as Sean and Greg said, I no longer have an EV, but for a number of years I did lease an EV and got rid of it primarily because times like this, when it's cold and snowy out, they tend to lose their luster. But we've been looking at the DTE rebates to try to add EV chargers where we've heard the desire for them, or we think that there might be a desire for them, and they are extremely expensive. But I agree with what Greg said. If you're outside of residential, it doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense because really the overnight charging is what you need, unless you're going to get into the DCFCs, which are extremely expensive to install and require 480 volt power, which isn't available at most locations. Speaking of the capacity, our project that just went through and was successful to get a variance down Mill Creek Townhomes is Detroit Edison only has single phase power in that region of town. And so in order to provide part of our argument to the ZBA, which was ultimately successful, was that in order to provide the service, just get DTE to provide service. We're not even talking about running any secondary wires or anything, but they had to bring in something like 26 separate services. I mean, it's insane. It's more than's already there. We have 300 existing townhomes and we don't have 26 services out there. So I think there's a real lack of understanding on the infrastructure side of what that involves, what kind of capacity is available in the grid, and what the cost associated with that is. I mean, that's, none of us can solve that. We can lean on DTE, and certainly I think they're hearing it, and it needs to be addressed from a societal standpoint. But without the capacity in the system, we really have an uphill battle there. But in the near term, if you're looking to revise the existing ordinance, I would say focus on residential uses, and also keep in mind, like with everything else we talked about with the minimums and maximums, the difference between downtown and periphery are very different. Downtown, you're mostly dealing with structured parking, not always. It's a lot easier to run surface mounted conduit in a parking garage, assuming you have the capacity in the building. It's a heck of a lot more cost to get a trenching machine out in the periphery and run conduit and then wire hundreds of yards. The wire size alone will destroy a project. So there needs to be a realization in any future revisions about the usage we're talking about. I like the idea of only focusing on projects that are affecting the parking configuration. And also, is it inside the DDA or is it outside the DDA district? Because those are very different. And I think those are things that can be done. And I would also agree with what Sean said about this EVR, which is like pull the wire but don't install the unit. That's kind of a bizarre thing. What we did, which was ultimately successful with ZBA, is we looked at that and we said, well, at this point you got the wire in, why don't you go ahead and put the unit in? So our offer to ZBA was that we ended up installing more car chargers, or we planned to install more car chargers than were required. But we did that by converting some of these EVRs into EVIs, because we already owed the wire as part of the ordinance. So another thing, I would look at eliminating that as well as we further tweak this.
Darren, you made a sort of, in your sort of introduction there, you talked about you occasionally get requests for them. I presume, based on this conversation, that tends to happen at residential, and based on the comments previously by Greg and Andrew, I'm presuming extending that to you as well, that it doesn't tend, those requests don't tend to happen at your office commercial locations.
I wouldn't say that categorically. Google's one of our tenants, and they have, of all the buildings that we own, the highest density of existing chargers as of today is at Google's.
Okay.
Now, Google took that on themselves and paid for all that themselves because they're a strong believer in the benefits to their employees, right? Most employers on planet Earth don't treat their employees with the lavishness that Google does. So they're kind of an outlier. I put a car charger in at our office for my own personal use when I had a vehicle. The way I did that is we're right next door to 201 Depot, where Smith Group is. So there's a couple people at Smith Group that utilize that charging station. I no longer use it because I'm back on petroleum fuel. I'm evil. But that's kind of the extent of where we've got them right now. At the residential areas, in terms of, on the north side of town, we have an apartment complex that has private garages. Those folks can plug in the garage. If they're parking in the outside, uncovered parking, they can run an extension cord. We're looking at installing those, but to the point about the cost, DT offers you $2,500 a port right now, which is, if you put in a 2-port charger, it's $5,000 a port. That doesn't cover your expense when you get into, running the wire and putting in the larger breakers, putting in concrete foundations, all the other ancillary things that have to happen. The DT rebates, which is really the only thing you've got right now, don't cover it. If the city really wants to encourage proliferation of charging stations, I would say, as opposed to using the stick method of requiring it during site plan, they use the carrot method, and they find some money and say, hey, you can get the DTE money, and then we'll give you this money on top of it. And I think if you've made it to the point where you could get property owners to at least break even, maybe even incentivize them and say, hey, we'll pay you more than your costs. I know that's crazy talk, but if you want something done, Show me the money.
Yeah, one of the things in the city's A20 plan is looking at sort of bulk purchase of chargers, for example. And I think I don't think it replaces what that model you were just sort of exploring or ideas there, but that could be one thing. Whereas the city has, we end up with a warehouse with 50 chargers. And so when a project comes along, we can offer those or offer them at maybe a reduced rate or something to that effect.
Well, keep in mind on car chargers, everybody on this phone call has, God knows how many, a drawer. I bet every one of us has a drawer or more in our house full of charging adapters, iPhones, computers, and iPods, and headphones when you go running, or God knows the proliferation of charging stations. The cars are no different. Whatever a dongle we use for our car today in 5 years is going to be obsolete and no one's going to use it. So these things are $10,000 a crack. Be careful going out and buying electronics, which in 5 years from now, that's not where the money is. The money is not in the chargers themselves. The money is in the infrastructure, upsizing the gear, providing the service, running that large gauge wire and conduit in the ground. That's the cost. And it's going to take time and money and effort to get us there, because we need to get there. But if we can identify funding, sources of money if the city can identify funding of sources of money to pay for this, that's going to get us there a lot faster without pushback than this requirement thing.
Any other thoughts?
So this is Greg. I had a couple of thoughts on things that were said. One is, I was at Tom Fitzsimmons' 309 Ashley project a couple of months ago and walking through it with him. And, he was before this EV ordinance, and he had prepped every single one of those parking spaces for EVs, right? And I asked him why he did that, and he basically said that because that's what it's cheaper to do now, and that's what the market wants. He knows he's going to get requests for it, right? But every parking place is assigned, so he didn't know necessarily where the chargers were going to go. So I recognize that's different at those kind of high-end residential for a market rate more outside the urban core. But just keep in mind, in my opinion, there ought to be some flexibility in addressing those kind of high-end projects, because anything you do downtown, you're probably going to, if you're providing parking, which somebody pointed out, you're going to have to, right? And we're doing the one project downtown. We're going to prep everything for EVs. We just don't know where the chargers are going to go until you sell the units. But the other thing I wanted to say is, just based on my experience with the level 2 chargers, I've done some research in trying to find some that I'd like to use here. And like Darren pointed out, we looked at the DTE plan. It's a weird hodgepodge of suppliers, right? They've got ChargePoint, who owns 70% of the market. And then one of the ones they have is a startup that hasn't provided anything outside of California. So some of the big names you see around aren't in that program. And there's a high variability in the effectiveness of the units. There's going to be consolidation in that market in the next 5 or 10 years. And I'm a little reluctant to bet on the poor horse, right? The other thing that I've found in looking at these is there's so many places that require them, but that's all they do is they require them, right? So you go up, they don't work, they're underpowered. I plugged into one level 2 charger that did my wife was laughing because the car said it was doing 3 miles an hour, right? My charger at home, I get 42 miles an hour. So they clearly had just put a real low amperage connection to it, right? Or they're not serviced, or they're not this or that, right? And so that's the other reason I don't rely on anything outside my house for my
Was that in the city?
needs.
Was that another charger in the city?
It wasn't in the city of Ann Arbor.
Oh, okay.
And I'll say, especially since Darren's on the phone, all the ones I've used at the city parking garages that the DDA provides have been great. The Clipper Creeks have worked every time. I appreciate them. They're free.
And they're free.
Exactly.
We're giving away electricity, which is crazy. That's a different topic.
Yeah, they've been great, right? So but what I'm saying is, it's more the one-offs. where somebody was required to do it. And again, this is outside the city. I haven't tested a lot of the ones inside the city. They were required to put it in as part of site plan approval or whatever, and it just doesn't get maintained. It was underpowered. It's not reliable. So I want mine at my house. I plan for using my one at my house. Everything else is gravy unless I'm, driving to Buffalo or something and I need an intermediate charge.
Charles?
Hey, yeah, sounds like a lot of good thoughts here. I was one of those people that helped with the ordinance, and I can see that there, might be some useful changes that could be made here. One of the common requests that at least I've seen in some of these waivers has to do with how, again, back to parking requirements, how many spots are required, and kind of what their uses are for. I agree with those who have said it makes more sense, for example, in say office parking spots to target the employees who are going to be parking there presumably all day or most of a day versus the flyby shopper. I would totally agree that those are not the use cases that we're trying to address here. You want to first address residential. I agree with that, and then second, mostly people who are employees who may not have the opportunity to charge at home because their apartment building or condo unit hasn't allowed that to happen yet, or created enough charging options for them. So it seems like there could be some adjustments made to target the sort of the employee parking spots that are going to be a part of any project. And I don't know how you calculate that, but I'm sure there's some method that you guys could probably come up with.
Yeah, and I think the EV parking ordinance reflects that to some extent. The required percentages for retail is different than office, which is different than residential. So I think part of that was intended to get there from the linking the what standard is appropriate for which land use. From a zoning perspective, talking about getting out of the way, the last thing I want to do though is be saying, okay, these parking spaces on a site plan are designated for employee and these are for customers. I think about it more in terms of right sizing what the requirement is with the use, probably than sort of sub reviewing or adding different standards to different portions of a parking lot.
This is Darren. One thing I'd add on that is that, the cheapest place to put these things is as close to the building as possible to limit your wire distance and wire size. And if you're in a retail situation, you want your customers parking up front. You want your employees parking in the back. So I think you're going down a dangerous road that you're not going to really be able to solve if you try to figure out how to make the employees at the retail centers get charging. That's tough.
And why, if there's a way to make that work, it happens probably at the beginning. Jeff, any questions that we didn't touch on from your mind?
No, this has been a great discussion, a really good start.
Yeah, I would say thank you. The same to all of you. Any last comments, thoughts? Thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise. Like I said, we will share this and we will take your feedback, hopefully towards crafting an appropriate way to improve our parking regulations.
This is Darren. If I could just say one final thing is, if there's one thing you take away from my standpoint on this, please do not impose parking maximums and get rid of any that you have. That is a terrible concept. and it should not be advanced any further. So if nothing else gets heard from today, that would be my takeaway.
Thank you. Sean, what's your headline?
I think I would agree with Darren. I think you need to allow the markets to kind of determine what the best and use is, and not impose those, because you may inadvertently pass something that will hinder development and not support development.
Thank you. Greg?
Yeah, I don't mean to triple underscore that, but as somebody mentioned earlier, I mean, no developer is going to build more parking than they need to, especially downtown. It's just not economically viable, right? But I just wanted to say I appreciate you and Jeff reaching out and giving us a proactive chance to provide input. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, not much more to add there. Definitely agree with Darren's sentiment about the anachronistic thinking with parking maximums. That's about it for me.
That's bureaucrats for you. Charles?
Yeah, I think I'm with the crowd here. No need for parking minimums. Don't want to get too crazy. Getting rid of parking that people are going to need and want if they're going to live in our lovely town. So, yeah. And hopefully there are some things that we can still think about for the EV ordinance if there are improvements that can be made there.
Brett, this is Jeff. I just wanted to say that if any member of the public would like to provide comments or has questions, that they should contact me at the city. My email address is J, and then the spelling of my last name, KAHAN @a2gov.org. Thank you. And I would be delighted if anyone were to reach out.
Thank you all so much. I am really grateful for your time and your expertise and your ideas. Your time's valuable, and I am really appreciative that you spent a little bit of it with us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Bye now.
Thanks, everybody.